Hey guys, it's Becky and today I'm reviewing the Traitor Prince by CJ Redwine. This is the third in a series of standalone fantasy books. They're all set in the same world but in neighbouring kingdoms with different characters, although apparently they do have some Easter eggs throughout. This book is about a prince who has been away for 10 years at school, training to be the best he can be. Because he's been away for 10 years, most of the people in his kingdom do not know what he looks like, including his father, the king. Because no one knows what he looks like, an imposter decides that assassinating the prince and pretending to be him is his best shot to become the leader of the kingdom. This means our prince has to find his way back to his kingdom and prove that he is the prince, whereby he then gets put into prison, where he's stuck until he can compete in a tournament to get the favour of the king, who will surely recognise him as his son. I, however, have not read either of the previous two books, so this review is purely about this particular book. After finishing this book, my first reaction was to check Goodreads because I wanted to check whether I had accidentally picked up a romance book. Unfortunately, it is stated as just a YA fantasy book, but it does not read that way, to me at least. It did read a lot like a romance that had been set in a fantasy world rather than a fantasy book. Because of it lacked a lot of the magical elements that I would normally love. The magic itself is extremely limited within this book because the only one out of the main leads who has magic is the female lead, and she can't actually use her magic because she is a slave and he has handcuffs which limit the magic. There are quite a few magical creatures that we see and were talked about during the whole book, but they are only used for fodder in the arena fights for the contestants to kill. This means that the majority of these magical creatures are only in the book for about a paragraph at a time, which just isn't enough for a fantasy book. We get brief explanations of what they are, we see them for a couple of lines, and then they're killed off by the contestant. As a whole, the lack of fantasy elements was really disappointing for me in a fantasy-led book. I was really expecting a lot more, and I just didn't get what I wanted from this book. One of the good things about the book, however, is that the characters are really well written, and they have their own backstories, and they have their own motivations, and they're all very individual characters. Even the imposter had his own backstory and his motivations, although it did get quite repetitive because he kept telling us over and over again. I did think that some of our secondary characters were not written as well. They did seem to be written as kind of a drive for the main characters to do things. I find that killing off characters is very lazy writing, which is the case for some of the deaths in this book. I didn't think they should have been brought into the book if they were only brought in to die and motivate a main character to take action or push the story forward. It just didn't work for me. Because the character hadn't been built up enough before as well, it wasn't meaningful to me. I did not have any kind of emotion about the death. I wasn't that interested in it, which was a real shame because I wish I had felt a bit of emotion. I felt like we really missed out on the world building. I think the author has obviously built up a world enough to have 3 different books set in it, but because we spend approximately 80% of this book stuck in the prison, all of that world building has been hidden behind the dull and lifeless walls of the prison. I felt it lacked a lot because we were told about the world by our main characters. It was talked about in the prison, but we rarely got to see any of it. And because of this, the book also seemed to drag a lot. We spent a lot of our time just going through the ritualistic time in prison. We had cleaning, we had training, we had fighting between prisoners, we had that whole romance plot which was extremely boring, at least it was for me because I don't have an interest in that kind of book. Every so often we had a big arena fight which was a bit more interesting, but it was a very basic like fighting scene, gladiator style. and it just didn't feel like it was bringing enough to the table to keep me interested in the long run. Overall, the book just didn't feel like a right fit for me because I'm much more of a high fantasy person. This book didn't bring enough fantasy into the premise, and it lacked a lot of things which I was expecting from it due to it being an anticipated read for many people. If any of you have read the first 2 books, could you let me know if they had the same problems, because I did originally want to read both of them. And thank you guys for watching. I hope to see you again soon.